Some flights in American airspace should never have ended on a runway. Engines stopped, controls failed. Parts of the aircraft broke away at cruising height. On paper, these flights should have become major accidents. Yet the crews found one last option. The aircraft stayed in the air long enough, and most of the people on board walked away alive. In this video, we will look at 10 flights that should have crashed, but instead became rare examples of survival in modern aviation. If you want more real stories from the sky, you can subscribe to Terra Obscura. On April 17, 2018, Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 left New York LaGuardia on a morning flight to Dallas Love Field. The airplane was a Boeing 737 with 149 people on board. Departure and climb were normal. In the cockpit, the first officer was flying while Captain Tammy Jo Schultz monitored the instruments. Cabin service had just begun when the airplane reached the low 30,000-foot range over Pennsylvania. A little after 11 o'clock, while climbing through about 32,000 feet, there was a sudden bang from the left side, followed by strong vibration and a yaw to the left. One of the large fan blades in the left engine had fractured due to a fatigue crack. The broken blade struck the engine's internal case and shattered. Parts of the inlet and outer covering tore away. Fragments of metal hit the wing and fuselage. Several pieces struck just ahead of a window in row 14 on the left side. The structure around that window failed. The window panel left the airplane, and the cabin went into rapid depressurization. Inside, there was an instant change from normal cruise to chaos. The roar of escaping air filled the cabin. Loose items were blown backward. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. At row 14, the failure of the window created a powerful airflow out of the opening. On the flight deck, the crew saw multiple warnings at once. The left engine instruments showed failure, and the airplane rolled and yawed left. The pressure warning indicated a loss of cabin pressure. The pilots donned their oxygen masks and began an emergency descent toward 10,000 feet, where people can breathe without supplemental oxygen. They shut down the damaged left engine and used the remaining right engine to maintain controlled flight while descending. Air traffic control cleared them direct to Philadelphia. The crew declared an emergency and reported an engine failure and a broken window with injuries. As they descended, the airplane's handling changed because of the damage. Drag from the exposed structures and dead engine required constant trim and power adjustments. The pilots had to manage airspeed, descent rate, and turns carefully, knowing the fuselage and wing leading edge were damaged. In the cabin, the environment slowly became more controlled after the first violent moments. Once the airplane descended to a safe altitude, passengers could remove oxygen masks. The pilots prepared for a single-engine landing. The loss of the left engine meant less thrust and some asymmetry. Flaps and landing gear were extended in stages. They flew a straightforward approach to a long runway. The jet touched down firmly, rolled out under control, and exited the runway surrounded by fire trucks and ambulances. Out of 149 people on board, 1 had died and 8 had minor injuries. The rest walked off the airplane, shaken but alive. The investigation found that a low-cycle fatigue crack in one of the fan blades had grown slowly over many cycles until the blade separated in flight. When it broke away and hit the engine case, parts of the engine's outer covering tore away and struck the fuselage near row 14. Southwest Airlines Flight is remembered for the tragic loss of a single passenger and for how a routine climb turned into a serious emergency in seconds. On 21 September 2005, JetBlue Flight 292 left California on a routine flight to New York JFK. The aircraft was an Airbus A320 with 146 people on board, climbing away from the San Fernando Valley on a clear afternoon. A few minutes after takeoff, a warning popped up in the cockpit. There was a problem with the nose landing gear. When the crew tried to retract it, it refused to move. The first officer kept flying while the captain opened the manuals and called JetBlue's maintenance control. The airplane headed toward the Long Beach area. Controllers cleared the flight to make a low pass over Long Beach Airport so people on the ground could look at the nose gear. As the jet flew past the tower, controllers, JetBlue personnel, and even a news helicopter all reported the same thing. The nose wheels were rotated about 90 degrees to the left, locked sideways in the well. Landing like that would mean the tires would shred instantly. The metal rims would scrape along the concrete, and there was a real risk of sparks and fire. The captain chose Los Angeles International Airport instead of Burbank or Long Beach. LA had much longer runways, more space, and a larger emergency response force. For more than 2 hours, the A320 flew holding patterns between Burbank and Los Angeles, burning off fuel because the type cannot dump it in flight. A lighter airplane meant lower landing speed, less stress on the damaged gear, and a smaller fire risk if something went wrong. In the cabin, the crew briefed passengers carefully and moved people into positions that would make an emergency evacuation easier. There was one detail unique to this flight: JetBlue's live satellite TV. Many passengers were able to watch news channels covering their own emergency in real time. complete with commentators speculating about how bad the landing could be. Flight attendants later said some people could not look away. Others were clearly more frightened by the coverage than by the smooth circling outside. Shortly before landing, the crew shut the system off to stop the feed from adding to the tension. Late in the afternoon, the plane lined up with runway at LA, more than 11,000 feet long. The touchdown plan was simple. Keep the main wheels on the ground as long as possible. Avoid reverse thrust so the nose wouldn't slam down, and let the airplane roll to a stop over a longer distance. The landing gear under the wings touched first, and the captain held the nose up, letting speed bleed away. When the nose finally came down, the sideways wheels met the concrete with a burst of smoke, rubber, and sparks. Flames flickered briefly as the tires tore apart, and the bare rims scraped along the centerline. But the jet stayed perfectly straight and on the runway until it came to a stop with about 1,000 feet to spare. Fire crews surrounded the aircraft, ready for a major blaze that never came. There were no injuries. The damage was confined mainly to the nose gear assembly and the ground-down wheels. Passengers walked off via mobile stairs instead of evacuation slides, stepping onto the tarmac of an airport. JetBlue didn't even serve at the time. For viewers, it looked like a miracle pulled off in full view of the world. For investigators, it was the start of a quieter, more technical story. The NTSB later found that small anti-rotation lugs inside the nose gear had failed from metal fatigue, and that the logic in the brake steering control system prevented the wheels from recentering once they jammed. Airbus and the gear manufacturer had already started redesign work. After this incident, inspections, software changes, and hardware improvements followed across the A320 fleet. JetBlue repaired the aircraft and returned it to service, and every time pilots now brief a nose gear problem and think about diverting to a longer runway, the calm, methodical landing of Flight 292 over Los Angeles is one of the quiet examples in the back of their minds. On April 28, 1988, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 left Hilo for Honolulu, a short hop that took only about 35 minutes on most days. The passengers were mostly island residents and commuters, used to the quick inter-island flights in Boeing 737s that went back and forth all day. This airplane had already flown several legs that morning without any problems. After takeoff, the crew leveled at 24,000 feet, cruising toward Oahu. There was no turbulence, no storm, no warning on the instruments that anything was about to go wrong. Then, a little after 13:46, everything changed in a single instant. There was a sudden, violent bang and a rush of air. The cabin pressure dropped so fast that passengers described a whoosh and then an almost total loss of normal sound. A large section of the roof over the forward cabin tore away from the airplane. Panels, insulation, and pieces of metal went with it. For the people sitting in the first rows, the ceiling simply disappeared. Above their heads there was no interior, no luggage bins, and no wall. There was open sky. The decompression was explosive. Wind screamed through the cabin at hurricane force. Loose objects flew backward. Oxygen masks in the affected area did not deploy properly because the system itself had been ripped apart with the structure. In the aisle near the fifth row, the lead flight attendant, Clarabelle Lansing, was swept out of the airplane. She vanished through the hole where the roof had been. Her body was never found. Other passengers nearby were held down only by their seatbelts and by their grip on the armrests. Many later said they could see the island, the ocean, and pieces of the airplane whipping past them while they sat exposed to the sky. Up front, the cockpit door had been torn away. The captain could see daylight where the first-class ceiling had been. The airplane rolled briefly, and the controls felt loose, but they still had some response. The first officer had been flying. The captain took control, pushed the nose down to begin an emergency descent, and reduced speed to ease the loads on the damaged structure. They put their oxygen masks on and declared an emergency, telling controllers they had lost part of the fuselage and needed an immediate landing. Kahului Airport on Maui was the closest usable runway. They turned toward it and began dropping from cruise altitude as quickly as they safely could. The condition of the airplane was worse than it first appeared. The blast that removed the roof had also damaged wiring, antennas, and parts of the control systems. Radio communication was intermittent. Some warning lights and gauges did not work correctly. The pilots had to fly mostly by hand, using basic instruments and outside references as they came down toward Maui. They did not know how much of the remaining fuselage might still fail if the loads or the speed became too high. In the cabin, the surviving crew moved through a space that now felt more like the back of a truck than an airliner. The forward section was open to the air. The floor had buckled in places. The noise made it almost impossible to talk, so flight attendants used gestures and brief shouts to tell passengers to stay seated, keep low, and hold on. Many people were injured by flying debris or by impacts with the cabin structure. Yet the fact that almost everyone had their seatbelt fastened kept most passengers inside the airplane when the skin tore away. As they approached Maui, the left engine began showing abnormal readings and vibrations. It had ingested debris and possibly pieces of the airplane's skin. The crew shut it down. Now they were lining up for landing on one engine in a structurally damaged 737 with uncertain control authority and incomplete instruments. The captain flew a higher than normal approach speed to preserve control. The airplane came in over the water and lined up with runway 02. The touchdown was firm. All three landing gears held. The airplane stayed on the runway, rolled out, and came to a stop surrounded by fire trucks and ambulances. Rescue crews moved in quickly. When they saw the missing roof and the rows of passengers sitting in open air, many assumed they would find large numbers of fatalities. Instead, they found a cabin full of injured but mostly conscious survivors. Out of 95 people on board, 1 had died, 65 were injured, and 94 survived. The image of the 737 with its roof torn off and people still sitting in their seats became one of the most famous photographs in aviation history. Investigators found widespread fatigue, cracking, and corrosion along a lap joint in the upper fuselage. This airplane had one of the highest cycle counts in the 737 fleet because it flew many short inter-island legs every day. Age, salt air, and moisture had allowed cracks to grow undetected. The accident triggered major changes to inspection rules for aging aircraft. On January 15, 2009, an Airbus A320 lifted off from New York LaGuardia Airport on a routine afternoon flight to Charlotte. It was US Airways Flight 1549. In the left seat was Captain Chesley Sullenberger, a former military fighter pilot with decades of airline experience. Behind them, 150 passengers and 3 flight attendants settled in for a short domestic flight. Weather was cold but clear. There was nothing to suggest that anything unusual was about to happen. About 2 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed through roughly 2,800 feet, the routine ended. The windshield suddenly filled with dark shapes. A flock of large Canada geese struck the aircraft almost head-on. There were loud bangs from both engines. Passengers near the wings saw flames and felt the airplane shake. Almost immediately, the sound of jet thrust faded and was replaced by a disturbing quiet. The crew had just experienced what commercial pilots train for, mostly in theory, a dual loss of thrust shortly after takeoff, at low altitude over a densely populated city. Captain Sullenberger took control and pushed the nose down slightly to preserve airspeed, because without thrust the jet had turned into a heavy glider. Every second that passed, the A320 lost more height over one of the most crowded urban areas in the world. Air traffic control offered options. The controller suggested turning back to LaGuardia. On a map, the distance still looked short. In the real sky, at that moment, it was far. The captain quickly assessed his position, speed, altitude, and rate of descent. He judged that any attempt to reverse course would probably end with the aircraft falling into buildings or roads. When the controller offered Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, the same problem remained. There was simply not enough height to reach any runway. He told the controller, with no emotion in his voice, that they would be in the Hudson. The crew had to clear the George Washington Bridge, avoid stalling, line up with the river, and touch down so that the airframe would stay in one piece. The A320 passed over the bridge with only a few hundred feet of clearance. In the cabin, some passengers could see cars on the span below. Flight attendants called for the brace position. There was no time for explanation. A few minutes after the bird strike, the airplane hit the surface of the Hudson. The impact felt like a very hard landing. Water sprayed over the windows and the aircraft decelerated rapidly, but stayed structurally intact. The hull began to take on water, yet the cabin remained survivable. The crew now faced a second life-and-death phase: evacuation in freezing conditions on a sinking aircraft. Captain Sullenberger opened the cockpit door and ordered an evacuation. Flight attendants opened the forward doors, inflating escape slides that also functioned as rafts. Passengers stepped out onto wings that quickly became wet and slippery as cold river water washed over them. The air temperature was below freezing. The water was only a few degrees above it. Within minutes, the second part of the miracle arrived. Commuter ferries began turning toward the floating aircraft. Their captains had seen the jet sitting low in the water. They came in as close as they could and started pulling people on board. Coast Guard and police boats joined them. Some passengers had to be lifted up in soaked clothing, unable to climb. All 155 people on Flight 1549 were rescued alive. About 100 suffered injuries, mostly from the impact and the cold, but there were no fatalities. For an accident that began with a dual-engine failure at low altitude over a city, that outcome was far beyond what anyone would predict. The investigation concluded that the choice to ditch in the Hudson was the best option available. The final report credited the successful ditching to the crew's quick decision-making, the structural design of the A320, and the fast response of nearby boats and emergency services. On February 24, 1989, United Airlines Flight 811 left Honolulu just after midnight on a long trip to Auckland and then on to Sydney. The airplane was a Boeing 747 with 337 passengers and 18 crew members on board. The departure was normal. After takeoff, the crew climbed out over the Pacific and leveled off in the low 22,000-foot range. Cabin service had just started, and many passengers were settling in for the night sector. About 17 minutes after takeoff, the crew heard a dull thump from somewhere below and ahead of the cockpit. It was strong enough to make the airplane shudder. Then, about a second later, the forward cargo door on the right side of the lower deck blew outward. The door tore away from its frame with enough force to rip a large hole in the side of the fuselage. Cabin air rushed out, the floor above the cargo compartment partially collapsed, and 10 seats near the right side of the business class cabin were ripped from their attachments and ejected into the night. 9 passengers who had been sitting in that section were blown out of the airplane and lost over the ocean. Those still strapped into neighboring rows suddenly found themselves looking at a jagged opening where the wall and windows had been. Through that opening, they could see the wing, the engines, and the dark Pacific beneath them. The decompression tore away parts of the cabin interior and damaged the emergency oxygen system, so some masks never dropped. Passengers and flight attendants clung to whatever they could reach as wind and debris blasted past them. In the cockpit, the noise and sudden pressure change told the crew they had suffered an explosive decompression. The captain and first officer quickly donned their oxygen masks and began an emergency descent. They started a turn to head back toward Honolulu while the flight engineer tried to contact the cabin. As the 747 descended and turned, new problems appeared. Debris from the ruptured fuselage had struck the right wing and both engines on that side. The number 3 engine began showing severe vibration, so the crew shut it down. Soon after, number 4 also showed a loss of power with visible flames, and it too was shut down. The airplane was now flying on 2 engines on the left wing, with a large hole in the fuselage. When the flight engineer reached the main cabin, he saw exposed frames where skin had peeled away, then the full opening on the right side. He returned to the cockpit and reported that a large section of the fuselage was missing. The pilots would have to be very careful with speed to avoid putting more load on the damaged structure than it could handle. As the jet approached Honolulu, the crew prepared for a high-risk landing. When they tried to extend flaps, the surfaces moved only part of the way and stopped. With only partial flaps and 2 engines shut down, they had to plan for a higher than normal approach speed. They declared an emergency, began dumping fuel to reach a safe landing weight, and coordinated with rescue services on the ground. Inside the cabin, flight attendants worked in extremely difficult conditions. The noise from the hole was so loud they could barely hear each other. The aisle near the brake was damaged, some floor panels had sagged, and there were injured passengers throughout the forward cabin. Crew members moved row by row to check seatbelts, calm people, and prepare them for an emergency landing. On final approach, the crew flew a steeper, faster profile than usual. Despite the missing section of cabin, the loss of 2 engines, and restricted flaps, the 747 remained flyable. The captain touched down at around 190 knots, higher than normal but within the range they had calculated. The airplane stayed on the runway, decelerated with reverse thrust from the 2 operating engines, and came to a stop surrounded by fire trucks and ambulances. Once secured, the crew ordered an evacuation. Slides were deployed and passengers exited quickly. Every flight attendant suffered some injury during the accident, but continued to assist people off the airplane. In total, 9 passengers had been lost when the cargo door failed. Dozens were hurt, but 346 people survived. The investigation focused on the cargo door and its latching system. After the missing door was recovered from the ocean floor, investigators found an electrical fault and weaknesses in the design of the outward opening door. A short circuit could power the latch cams toward the open position even with the handle locked, and the aluminum lock pieces were not strong enough to resist this. When the latches moved, the door could open under pressure at altitude and tear away from the fuselage, exactly as it had on Flight 811. On May 24, 1988, TACA Flight 110 left Belize City on a short hop to New Orleans. It was a routine leg on a familiar route, flown by an experienced crew in a relatively new Boeing 737. There were 45 people on board. Over the Gulf of Mexico, the flight was smooth. As they approached Louisiana, the crew could see on their weather radar that thunderstorms were forming near the coast, which is normal for that time of year. They began to plan a descent that would keep them clear of the worst of the weather and still line them up for New Orleans. During descent, the radar picture became more complicated. Ahead of the 737, bands of green and yellow showed rain, and clusters of red on both sides of their path marked intense cells. The pilots chose what looked like a gap between those red areas. They selected continuous ignition and turned on engine anti-ice, standard precautions before entering heavy cloud. Around 30,000 feet, the airplane entered solid overcast. Turbulence increased, rain began to hammer the fuselage, and hail started to strike the nose and windscreen. Outside, the cockpit windows showed only gray and white. Inside, the crew could feel the airplane shaking more than usual as it pushed deeper into the storm. Descending through about 16,500 feet, the sound of the engines changed in a way no crew wants to hear. There were several heavy thumps and a deep shudder. Then, the steady roar of thrust faded almost completely. Both engines lost power and flamed out within seconds of each other. In the cabin, passengers noticed an unnatural quiet and a change in vibration. The 737 had become a glider in severe weather, with no usable thrust and no runway in sight. The crew lowered the nose slightly to protect airspeed and started the auxiliary power unit to restore electrical and hydraulic power. While the airplane continued to descend, they began the restart checklist and tried to bring the engines back. Their first attempts used the airflow from the descent to spin the engines and relight them. Nothing happened. With the APU running, they tried starter-assisted restarts. This time both engines came back at idle. But when the pilots advanced the throttles, temperatures rose rapidly toward the limits, and the engines refused to spool up to produce real power. Heavy rain and hail had damaged the internal parts, while the engines were at low thrust. Higher settings were no longer safe. Rather than risk an engine fire on top of the dual failure, the crew shut both engines down again. TACA 110 was once more gliding, now lower and closer to the ground, with only gravity, and the pilot's control inputs keeping the jet under control. New Orleans controllers suggested headings toward the main international airport and toward the closer lakefront airport. On radar, both looked like possible destinations. In the cockpit, with the altimeters dropping and the ground still hidden in cloud, the crew quickly realized that neither airport was within gliding range. They briefly discussed ditching in a straight canal once they came out of the weather. Landing a 737 on water in an industrial area would be extremely dangerous, but at least it offered a flat surface and some chance of survival. Whatever they chose, they had only a few minutes and one attempt. When TACA 110 finally broke out beneath the cloud base, the pilots saw marsh, canals, roads, and industrial buildings on the eastern edge of New Orleans. They turned toward a wide canal that could serve as a ditching area. Then they saw something better. Running beside the water was a long, narrow grass levee, a raised strip that looked roughly the right length and just wide enough for the landing gear of a 737. The captain turned gently to line up with the levee instead of the canal. To manage speed and glide path without any thrust, he used a slight side slip, cross-controlling the airplane to increase drag and fine-tune the descent so they would reach the levee without overshooting it or stalling short. The landing gear was lowered to absorb the impact and provide braking. Flaps were set to a practical position, limited by the available hydraulic power. In the cabin, flight attendants called for the brace position and moved through their final checks. Passengers saw a brief flash of green and water outside the windows, then felt a hard impact. The 737 touched down on the grass, ran along the top of the levee, and stayed upright. The main wheels dug into the soft ground, but the airplane remained on the strip and did not slide into the canal on either side. When it came to a stop, it was sitting on a narrow piece of land between the water and the industrial complex, in a place no airliner was ever meant to land. There was no fire, and the fuselage stayed intact. Overhead, bins had opened, and loose items were scattered, but the cabin remained structurally sound. The crew ordered an evacuation. Doors were opened on the safe side, and people stepped down onto the grass and walked away from the jet. All 45 occupants survived, and no one suffered serious injuries. For a dual engine failure at relatively low altitude in a thunderstorm, with no runway reachable, this outcome was far better than any standard risk calculation would suggest. Investigators later confirmed that the 737 had flown into a powerful thunderstorm and that heavy rain and hail had caused both engines to flame out while they were at low power during descent. The engines met the certification standards for water ingestion, but those tests did not fully reflect the conditions the crew encountered that day. The manufacturer went on to modify the design to improve ignition behavior and drainage in extreme precipitation, and to reduce the amount of water and hail reaching the engine core. Guidance for flying near strong convective weather was also updated in light of several similar incidents. On July 19, 1989, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 left Denver on a regular United Airlines service to Chicago. It was United Airlines Flight 232. In the left seat was Captain Al Haynes. At the flight engineers panel sat Second Officer Dudley Dvorak. There were 296 people on board. The airplane climbed to cruising altitude, leveled at 37,000 feet over the Midwest, and settled into a quiet afternoon cruise. To the crew, this was one more long-haul sector in an aircraft they knew well, with 3 engines and 3 independent hydraulic systems that, according to the design, made a complete loss of control practically impossible. At 15:16, while the DC-10 was in a gentle right turn, the number 2 engine in the tail suddenly exploded. Passengers heard a loud bang and felt a strong shudder through the cabin. On the flight deck, warning lights came on, gauges flickered, and the autopilot dropped offline. The crew's first thought was an engine failure, something they were trained to handle. But this did not behave like a normal shutdown. When they tried to move the throttle and fuel controls, they were jammed. At the same time, the needles for all 3 hydraulic systems began to fall toward zero. Within seconds, all 3 systems that powered every primary flight control on the airplane had lost pressure. The yokes still moved in the pilot's hands, but the control surfaces at the tail and wings no longer responded. The DC-10 had lost its normal means of turning, climbing, and descending. Dudley Dvorak called out what he was seeing. 3 sets of hydraulic pressure gauges were now reading almost nothing. The checklists did not cover this situation. There were procedures for losing 1 system, even 2 systems. But the manufacturer had considered a total hydraulic failure so unlikely that they had not written a checklist for it. Haynes and Records tried their control columns anyway. Even with the yokes pulled fully back and turned fully left, the airplane continued to bank right and drop its nose. To stop the roll, the crew reduced thrust on the left wing engine and increased thrust on the right wing engine. Slowly, the aircraft leveled. They had discovered the only crude control they had left. By changing power on the 2 remaining engines, they could make the airplane pitch up or down and roll left or right. This kind of control was rough and delayed. The DC-10 began to move in a repeating cycle. The nose would come up, speed would fall, then the nose would drop and the aircraft would accelerate and lose altitude. Each cycle cost about 1,500 feet of height. Among the passengers was another United captain, Dennis Fitch, a DC-10 instructor who was traveling on the jump seat. After the explosion, he sensed that the crew might need help. When Fitch entered the cockpit, he quickly realized that the normal control system was gone. Haynes asked him to look out at the wings to see if the ailerons were moving. Fitch reported that they were not moving at all. The control columns had become symbolic. The only meaningful input now came from the thrust levers. Fitch took the throttles, one in each hand, and began to work them constantly, small movements to damp the oscillations and to steer. As they lined up towards Sioux City, the crew faced difficult choices. They had to decide whether to lower the landing gear, which would create drag but would also absorb some of the impact. They chose to drop the gear using the alternate system. They also had to accept that they would not have normal flaps. Without hydraulic power, the high-lift devices could not deploy. That meant they would have to approach at a higher speed than usual, making the landing more violent. In the cabin, flight attendants received a short, honest briefing from the cockpit. They were told that the crew might not be able to control the landing and that the impact could be rough. Passengers were instructed in the brace position. People wrote quick notes to their families. As Flight 232 came in toward the airport, it was clear that the crew did not have the fine control needed for a normal landing. The right wing sat slightly low, and the nose was dropping more than they wanted. Fitch pulled the right engine back and pushed the left one up, trying to level the wings. The rate of descent remained high. The DC-10 crossed the runway threshold fast and low. A moment later, the right wingtip and right landing gear struck the ground first. The aircraft pivoted, the tail broke off, and the fuselage began to tumble and break apart. Fuel spilled and ignited, sending fire through parts of the wreckage. When the motion finally stopped, what had been a single large airliner was now scattered across fields in several large pieces. Inside those broken sections, survivors began to move. Some unbuckled their belts and stepped directly out onto the ground through gaps where the fuselage had torn away. Others were trapped and waited for firefighters to cut them free. Rescue workers entered the debris, pulled people out, and sent the most serious cases to hospitals. Out of the 296 people on board, 112 died from impact forces and fire. The remaining 184 survived, many with serious injuries, but alive. For a wide-body airliner that had lost all 3 hydraulic systems and then crash-landed out of control, this survival rate was far beyond what anyone would have predicted. Later simulator studies, flown by experienced DC-10 crews, were unable to reproduce a landing with any survivors under the same conditions. Investigators traced the accident back to a single fan disc in the No. 2 engine. A fatigue crack had grown slowly over many years of service. Inspections had failed to detect the flaw. When the disc finally failed, the fragments tore through the tail section and cut every hydraulic line, defeating the redundancy that the design had depended on. After the accident, engine manufacturers changed their inspection processes. The industry also used the flight as a textbook case for crew resource management, showing how a crew could work together under extreme pressure without losing discipline or cooperation. On April 7, 1994, FedEx Flight 705 left Memphis on what should have been a routine cargo run to San Jose. The airplane was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 with 3 flight crew members and 1 deadheading flight engineer seated in the jump seat. There were no passengers. Departure, taxi, and takeoff all looked normal. A few minutes after liftoff, events on board shifted from routine operations to a fight for survival that had nothing to do with engine failures or weather and everything to do with a deliberate plan to crash the airplane. The extra person on the flight was Auburn Calloway, a FedEx flight engineer traveling in the jump seat to reposition for duty. He was under internal review at the company and facing the loss of his job. He had brought a guitar case on board. Inside, there was no guitar. Instead, there were hammers and a spear gun. They were not detected because there was no screening for company employees on cargo flights. Calloway's plan was to kill the crew using these tools, take control of the DC-10, and crash it so the incident would appear to be an accident. That way, his family could still collect life insurance. Shortly after takeoff, when the airplane was climbing through about 19,000 feet, Calloway left his jump seat and moved behind the pilots. He pulled out a hammer and attacked from behind. He struck the captain, first officer, and flight engineer in rapid succession, aiming at their heads. The blows caused serious skull fractures and heavy bleeding. The cockpit became a close-quarters fight in a cramped space. Despite their injuries, all 3 crew members fought back. Calloway also used the spear gun, firing it in the cockpit. 1 shaft embedded itself in the bulkhead. Blood covered the control pedestal and sidewalls. The crew realized their attacker was trying to kill them, and that if he succeeded, he could crash the airplane. They needed to get the DC-10 back on the ground quickly. While grappling with Calloway, they managed to declare an emergency and request a return to Memphis. The captain, David Sanders, despite a fractured skull, got back into his seat and put his hands on the controls. To throw Calloway off balance, Sanders began making extreme maneuvers. He rolled and pitched the DC-10 far beyond normal flight. The large cargo jet banked up to 140 degrees and made sharp pitch changes, forcing Calloway to grab for support and giving the other crew members openings to fight him. These maneuvers placed enormous stress on the airframe. The load factor reached about 2.5 to 2.7 G, far higher than standard flight. The DC-10 was not designed to be flown as a fighter jet, but its structural margins worked in the crew's favor. While Sanders flew, First Officer Jim Tucker and Flight Engineer Andy Peterson focused on subduing Calloway. All 3 crew members suffered repeated blows and cuts. One had a fractured skull, another had a nearly severed ear, and all had deep lacerations and significant blood loss. Yet they managed to overpower Calloway, pin his arms, and restrain him with belts and straps. With the attacker under control, The crew turned their attention to landing. They were still bleeding, still in severe pain, and the cockpit was cluttered with blood and broken items. They had to manage checklists, communicate with air traffic control, and configure the airplane while dealing with impaired vision and reduced strength. Despite this, they set up for a return to Memphis, coordinated with emergency services, and flew an approach within the aircraft's limits. On final approach, the DC-10 was still heavy and structurally stressed from the earlier maneuvers, but it remained controllable. The landing was firm, but successful. The airplane stayed on the runway and came to a stop with rescue vehicles moving into position. Medical teams rushed on board. All 3 pilots had life-threatening head injuries, but they survived. Calloway was arrested and later convicted on multiple charges, including attempted murder and air piracy. He received a life sentence without parole. The DC-10 was found to have suffered structural damage from the high-G maneuvers, but was repairable and eventually returned to service. Investigators drew several lessons from FedEx Flight 705. Internal threats from employees cannot be dismissed simply because a flight is all cargo. Tools that look ordinary in a freight environment can be deadly in a cockpit. After the attack, FedEx and other cargo operators changed security procedures and tightened screening on company flights. Another lesson was about crew resource management. The 3 men shared tasks under conditions that would have overwhelmed most people. Flying a large airplane far outside its normal envelope, fighting off a determined attacker, and making rapid decisions while seriously injured. When we talk about accidents and near accidents in the sky, it is easy to focus on a single moment. The bang of an exploding engine. The instant a door or a window gives way. The second when a pilot looks at the instruments and realizes that normal control is gone. In those moments, it feels as if everything depends on one decision, one pull on the controls, one line on a checklist. But if you look at the 10 flights we have followed in this video, you start to see something else. You see long chains of design choices, maintenance practices, training sessions, and past incidents that all come together in the space of a few minutes. You see how the outcome on a single day is shaped by decisions made many years earlier in factories, training centers, and meeting rooms that most passengers will never hear about. On several of these flights, the first link in the chain was a design flaw or an incomplete understanding of how a system would behave in the real world. A cargo door that could appear locked when it was not. Lap joints in a fuselage that slowly cracked under the strain of thousands of pressurization cycles. An engine fan blade that carried a hidden defect until it failed at cruise altitude. Landing gear that could twist beyond its intended range and stay stuck there. None of these things were meant to happen. All of them passed through certification processes that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of surprise. When the failures finally appeared in service, they were not just technical issues. They were reminders that safe flight is not a fixed achievement. It is a moving target that has to be adjusted every time reality exposes a gap in the way we think about risk. What turned these events from likely disasters into survivable accidents was not luck alone. It was the way crews and aircraft reacted under pressure. A dual-engine failure that turned a jet into a glider could have ended with wreckage in a neighborhood or in open water. Instead, crews used every remaining control, including tools that are rarely used in training, to put their airplanes down on rivers, levees, and runways they were never supposed to see. A wide body that lost all normal hydraulics should have been uncontrollable. Instead, pilots learned to fly it with engine thrust and brought it close enough to a runway that more than half the people on board survived an impact that was expected to be fatal. A jet with a gaping hole in its side, or a cabin open to the sky, or a window missing at 30,000 feet, stayed in one piece long enough for pilots to descend, for flight attendants to organize passengers, and for emergency crews to position themselves on the ground. If you look more closely, you also see how much of the work in these stories was done by people whose names rarely appear in headlines. Flight attendants pulling a passenger back from a missing window and then continuing to move through a cabin filled with debris. Crew members shouting simple instructions in a space where normal speech is drowned out by wind and engine noise. Mechanics who later helped investigators piece together what had gone wrong by providing maintenance records and honest accounts of what they had seen on the ramp. Air traffic controllers clearing entire chunks of airspace in seconds, giving damaged aircraft direct paths to airports instead of long arrivals and holding patterns. Firefighters, paramedics, and airport staff who trained for mass casualty events they hoped would never happen, and then put those plans into action on the one day they were needed. Safety actually works. A single layer failed in almost every event we looked at. A door design, an engine part, an inspection program, a component in a control system. But other layers held. Structures stayed stronger for longer than the minimum requirements. Backup systems kept instruments alive when primary ones failed. Training gave crews at least a mental starting point for situations they had never seen outside a simulator, and sometimes not even there. Afterward, investigations turned specific tragedies into concrete changes: new inspection rules, redesigned parts, revised procedures, better ways of tracking fatigue in metal and in people. Modern aviation safety is built out of these lessons. Every line in a manual that tells a crew what to do when something fails comes from someone's experience, and sometimes from someone's death. If you have stayed with me to this point, you already know that these stories are not about sensational fear. They are about how complex systems fail, and how people inside those systems respond when they do. If you want to keep exploring real events like this, to see what went wrong, what went right, and what changed after, you can subscribe to Terra Obscura, leave a like, and tell me which flights or incidents you want to see next. It helps this channel grow. It tells me that these deep dives are worth the time, and it brings more people into a space where we can look at aviation not as a mystery, but as a human effort to make something as dangerous as flight as safe as we know how to make it.